I really hope this is what everyone means by using a green screen, because I tried to do the video out there, but it is really sunny out and everything was blowing out. There are many streaming protocols out there. For instance, HLS, Dash, MPEG Sash, RTMP, RTSP, BB, LLBBB, LLLLBBBB, and smooth streaming. Some of these aren't used much anymore. Some of these aren't real, and some of these were never used as much as they should have been used. Sorry, Phil. There are others too, but we all know the two most popular, HLS and Dash, which by this progress bar account for 95% of all online streaming, which is a number that I completely made up, but seems somewhat legitimate. As a player developer, I've worked with both HLS and Dash extensively. And both are great, but both can also be troublesome to work with and debug. So with that in mind, let's write my preferred streaming protocol. First, let's talk about goals. I know I mentioned that HLS and Dash can be troublesome to work with, but what does that mean exactly? What makes something troublesome to work with? And more importantly, flipping that around, what makes something easy to work with and easy to debug? First, it should be easy to read. The benefit of having an easy-to-read manifest is that it makes it easy to debug. A surprising amount of debugging is just done by reading through the manifest and finding what's wrong visually. I've spent, at this point, more of my life reading manifests than I probably have reading books. I don't know what this says about me, but I do think if we could tone that down a bit, I might have more time to actually do proper reading. HLS is pretty easy to read. You ignore the # EXTX, and the rest is basically just text. Dash is also pretty easy to read, if you're a computer. With enough squinting and looking past the XML accoutrements, you can get a sense of what's going on. Still, I think we can improve in both areas. Second, it should be easy to work with. The first step of all player developers, besides read the manifest, is to parse it. And parsing it means parsing it into JSON, because the world runs on JSON. For better or worse. You may think that this means we should send the manifest down as JSON, which is a solid option. I see you, MPEG Sash. But JSON is, again, not the easiest format to read. I spend a lot of my time in tools like Charles and the DevTools network panel in Chrome. And although there are tools to make reading JSON easier, those ones don't make it too easy. There's a lot of scrolling up and down to try and figure out what's going on. So I think we can improve there. Next part of easy to work with is accurate and easily available information, which for streaming protocols usually means timing information of the segments, the start and end time of each. Normally, a player developer has to actually parse the segments and figure out the timing values within each container format, but the backend knows the container formats pretty well and can do it once for all players, instead of each player having to develop parsing logic for each container format. Not only will this save a lot of player headache, or player developer headache, but this can single-handedly save the environment by the reduced processing time. The third goal is that we should have a simple specification. Here's the HLS specification, and here is the Dash specification. And don't forget the Dash interop specification, because you need that too. Although these are very detailed and useful for all the features they add, the length makes it hard to read some of these specifications. I want to make the specification simple enough that we can fit it into the rest of the time in this video. Now that we know the goals, let's talk about what features or capabilities we have to support. HLS and Dash were created to reuse the HTTP infrastructure, for instance, CDNs, request caching, and guaranteed delivery. But they also were created to support certain features, for instance, live playback, or alternate bit rates of streams, so that we could actually do ABR. Alternative codecs, so that different devices can play back the content that they actually support. Alternative media, for instance, different languages for audio streams, or a different cut of a video, a different angle, or just subtitles. And finally, discontinuous media, being able to cut other media into your stream without having to encode it differently. We're going to add all of these features, I hope. But before we do, we have one big decision to make. And that's whether we're going with a single manifest, like Dash, or multiple manifests, like HLS. And I can tell you firsthand that working with multiple manifests is one of the most troublesome things to deal with, because anytime you have desynchronization between different variants, it becomes a big headache to debug what's actually going on, and to be able to sync up the two between discontinuity sequence and media sequence, and there's a whole lot of trouble that comes with it. So we're going with one manifest. Dash wins a point for this round. Now that we know that we're using one manifest file, we have to identify the file. HLS uses ext-m3u because, well, it's an extension of the m3u format. Dash uses the XML version and an MPD tag. To identify ours, we first need a name, which is something that is more troublesome to me than desyncing playlists. So we're going with the TV emoji. Everyone knows that's the easiest thing to parse. Now that we can identify our manifest, we're moving on to capabilities. First, let's add support for signaling whether this is a VOD or live stream. To signal VOD or live, HLS uses the presence or absence of the EXTX endless tag. And Dash uses an attribute type on the MPD tag with a value of static or dynamic. We'll just use isLive with true or false. Now on to different bitrate support. You know, variants, renditions, streams, alternative streams, representations, whatever you want to call them. I'm going to call them streams because this is streaming media. Well, these are next because when I debug manifests, I almost always want to see what's available before diving further. And while we're at it, let's handle codec details, resolutions, bit rates, muxed versus demuxed, and what's default and what's not. I won't go into exactly where HLS and Dash puts these details because they're not as easy to fit onto a slide. But for us, we're going to indent them below each stream. And each gets a separate line because it's really hard reading manifests when all of the properties are on a single line. Now we need to specify segments. HLS has separate variants where there are lists of segments. Dash includes representations with different ways of specifying them. For instance, segment templates and lists. It's often much easier looking at HLS manifests with simple lists, and while Dash offers flexibility, I only want one way to specify segments, so we're going with lists. But we're going one step further. Dash allows you to use a template string for specifying segments within representations, and HLS recently added the EXTX define tag with variable substitution to similar effect. But one thing that sometimes bothers me is that each variant can have a different template. For our purposes, I want a top-level template that includes an identifier for the stream and identifier for the segment number. And on that note, I want a segment number for every segment to consistently identify it. There's one more topic we can never get away from when discussing segments and manifests. Times. Oh my gosh, times. There are so many when we talk about streaming. There's wall clock time, stream advertised time, what I call stream time, but is often referred to as presentation time, which is what you see on the progress bar, and then there's the real presentation and decode times of the underlying media. I don't know how we can ever discuss times in streaming technologies without going through a glossary at the beginning of the discussion. We're going to skip wall clock time, that's a V2 item, and we're not doing a stream advertised time. We're requiring precision. There will be a few time values, stream time, or the time the user sees on the progress bar, and presentation and decode times, the first and last frame's value within each segment. This prevents me, and any other player developer, from ever having to parse the time values out of the underlying media and visually spot gaps in the manifest. So we've got live. Just make sure to refresh the manifest when isLive is set to true. And we've got multiple bit rates and codecs and alternative media support. Last on the list is discontinuous media. This is anytime we want to insert media where the underlying presentation and decode time values change. They're from a different timeline. And there are potentially a few other aspects of the stream that can change as well. But for an example, this can be inserting an ad, a clip from another video, or even resolving a gap in content or repeating the same clip over again in a live stream. In HLS, these are called discontinuities and are signaled by the EXTX discontinuity tag. In Dash, period tags are used. The key difference here is that in Dash, periods are a higher up tag in the hierarchy than representations, while in HLS, discontinuities exist within each variant. For us, we're going to add in a scissor emoji anytime there's a disco, because again, emojis are definitely the easiest thing to parse. We're going with more of an HLS approach here, but that's because if you've ever looked at a multi-period Dash manifest and tried to read what was going on at the point of time when the period was changing, you've probably spent hours copying and pasting sections to line them up. HLS definitely deserves a point here. But stepping back a bit, this is only my preferred streaming protocol, and for many others it's probably a nightmare. And I know no one's going to use this protocol, and the world isn't perfect, and many of the issues that I have with HLS and Dash were just trade-offs that were made to support certain use cases and features that people needed. But what I want to take away from this is that even though HLS and Dash can be troublesome, I do think they could be easier to work with. And I think that could come about if the back end, the people that are actually writing the manifest, communicate more with the player developers, the people that are actually working with the manifest. And just because the specification says something is possible and that it can be done, doesn't necessarily mean that we should do it that way. And if we have more of that communication between the two, and we try and create manifests that work better for downstream users as well as the people who are actually writing it, then we'll have happier developers all along the stack, and we'll probably have more robust streams along the way. Thank you.